American soldiers in Vietnam sometimes joked nervously that they were not guarding bridges against men, but against ghosts. They had spotlights sweeping across the water, sentries with rifles on both ends, barbed wire stretched into the current, and mines sunk into the muddy riverbed. Helicopters circled overhead and engineers fortified the approaches with bunkers and sandbags. Yet bridges still sometimes vanished in fire. There were no footsteps, no gunshots, no infiltrators caught in the act. The sentries heard nothing but the river moving past. Then in an instant the sky tore open and the structure beneath their boots dissolved in thunder. What haunted them was not artillery or bombers but something that seemed ridiculous, even laughable. Balloons, clusters of inflated rubber bags, drifting silently down the current until they pressed themselves against the pilings and tore steel and timber apart. In the jungles of Vietnam, the strongest military machine on Earth discovered that even air trapped inside scraps of rubber could bring its war to a halt. The Vietnam War was unlike anything the United States had ever fought. On one side were America and its South Vietnamese allies, bringing modern firepower, helicopters that shook the sky, supersonic jets, tanks, napalm, and engineering corps that could carve highways and erect steel bridges in a matter of days. On the other side were the forces of North Vietnam and the Viet Cong guerrillas, men and women drawn from villages, rice fields, and jungles. They were poorly supplied, often armed with second-hand rifles or equipment decades old. Many of them were peasants who had traded their plows for rifles and their fishing nets for satchel charges. They could not match the Americans in technology, so they turned instead to ingenuity. They dug tunnel systems that spread like veins under the soil, built traps from sharpened bamboo, carried heavy loads on bicycles, and transformed the land itself into a weapon. It was a war of contrasts, industrial power against improvisation, high technology against raw cunning. And in that uneven struggle, something as absurd as a balloon could become an instrument of fear. To understand why, one must understand the geography of Vietnam and the role of bridges in the war. The country was shaped by water. The Mekong Delta sprawled like a living web, its countless rivers and canals feeding paddies and villages. Further north, the Perfume River wound through Hue, while the Dong Nai carried traffic through the Central Plains. Tributaries cut across the land like scars. For the U.S. military, these waterways were obstacles that had to be conquered with steel and timber. Bridges were not just convenient, they were lifelines. Supply convoys full of food, fuel, and ammunition relied on them to push deeper into contested territory. Without bridges, tanks sat idle, jeeps turned back, and forward bases withered. Helicopters could resupply some garrisons, but not enough to keep an army moving. A single destroyed span could paralyze operations for days or weeks. The Viet Cong knew this. To them, every bridge was worth more than a dozen enemy soldiers. A single blast at the right place could choke off entire divisions. Bridges became the arteries of war, and if you cut an artery, the body weakens. The Americans understood the danger, which is why they protected their bridges with almost obsessive care. Searchlights scanned the waters every few minutes. Mines were dropped in channels. Patrol boats prowled upstream. Sappers who tried to swim beneath were often spotted and shot. Direct assaults cost lives and rarely succeeded. Yet despite every precaution, the bridges still sometimes fell. The first guerrillas who thought of using balloons were likely not soldiers but tinkerers, men who had scavenged the detritus of American camps. U.S. troops left behind piles of rubber, gloves, ponchos, tubing, and small rubber bags from supply kits. To an American soldier, they were disposable, meant to be used once and discarded. To a Vietnamese villager, they were raw material. They could patch a bicycle tire, seal a water jar, or, if filled with gas, float like balloons. Someone discovered that if you clustered them, they could lift surprising weight. Add the endless rivers of Vietnam, and suddenly there was a way to deliver explosives silently, carried by the current. What began as an absurd idea in the jungle soon turned into one of the most unsettling tactics of the war. The preparation was as painstaking as it was dangerous. In hidden camps deep in the jungle, fighters cobbled together crude gas generators from barrels and bamboo. Methane from pig waste bubbled into tubes, acetylene hissed from carbide lamps, hydrogen escaped from improvised chemical reactions. The air grew foul as balloons swelled and shivered in the dim lamplight. Children tied them off with strips of cloth, their small fingers nimble. Women carried them hidden beneath baskets of rice. Explosives were carefully wrapped in wax, tar, or clay jars to keep out the water. Stones were tied on as ballast, ensuring they floated just beneath the surface, invisible in the darkness. Fuses were coded, timers improvised, sometimes as simple as a waterproofed length of cord, sometimes an acid drip that would burn through cloth only after hours of travel. Every detail was calculated because once the balloons were set free on the river, there was no controlling them. The current would deliver them to their target, or carry them away to burst harmlessly downstream. Now place yourself on that river at midnight. The Mekong moves like oil under the canopy, black and slow. American soldiers guard the bridge above. One shifts his rifle strap and stifles a yawn. Another draws on a cigarette, the ember flaring red. A spotlight sweeps across the water, catching only reeds and floating logs. Beneath the surface, unseen, a cluster of balloons drifts closer, pressing softly against the pilings. For minutes, there is nothing but the hum of insects and the murmur of water. Then the sky rips open. Fire erupts from the pilings, steel shrieks as it bends, with splinters into the air, and the bridge collapses into the river with a roar that drowns even the jungle's voice. By the time engineers and patrols scramble from their bunkers, the saboteurs are gone, vanished into the night, leaving only smoke, wreckage, and the knowledge that balloons have outwitted barbed wire and machine guns. For the Americans, it was a humiliation as well as a logistical nightmare. The most advanced army in the world was being crippled by scraps of rubber filled with air. Engineers first dismissed reports as exaggeration, but the evidence was there in twisted beams and burning convoys stranded on the banks. Soldiers began to fear the rivers. They fired at every floating branch, every shadow that moved with the current. Ammunition was wasted in panic. Commanders ordered nets strung beneath bridges. Barbed wire stretched across rivers. Patrols sent upstream to intercept. The guerrillas adapted just as quickly, launching further away, camouflaging the balloons among reeds, timing them to arrive in the middle of storms when noise and rain masked their presence. Each defense sparked a counter. Each counter sparked another adaptation. And through it all, the rivers carried their silent cargo, indifferent to who claimed the land on either bank. The ingenuity behind the balloons was born of necessity, but once the idea proved itself, it spread like wildfire among guerrilla units across the Mekong Delta and beyond. Fighters shared techniques in whispers, passing along recipes for generating gas as if they were family secrets. Some swore by methane from animal waste, others relied on acetylene scraped from carbide lamps, and still others experimented with chemical powders stolen from American stores. The equipment was primitive, but it worked. A barrel half buried in the ground became a gas generator. Bamboo tubes served as funnels. A single candle provided the light by which men tied off the balloons, their hands sticky with wax from sealing fuses. The air reeked, sweat ran freely, but there was no complaining. Each balloon tied and sealed was another chance to cripple the invader. The explosives themselves were a patchwork of ingenuity. Some were scavenged from unexploded American bombs dug from the earth, their deadly cores carefully removed and repacked. Others were captured grenades bundled together, or artillery shells reworked with crude timers. Wax was melted down from beehives or scavenged candles to waterproof the fuses. Clay jars, the kind used for storing rice wine, became housings for charges. The guerrillas dipped them in tar or resin until they gleamed dark and waterproof, then bound them with ropes and tied them beneath the balloons. The whole contraption looked laughably crude. Scraps of rubber, twine, wax, and clay. But when carried by the current, it was silent, invisible, and devastating. To the Americans who first encountered these strange devices, it was both surreal and terrifying. One engineer later recalled standing on a bridge near Mytho when a shout went up from a sentry. Something was floating against a piling. At first it looked like a bundle of reeds. Then he saw the faint bulge of rubber between them. The patrol opened fire, bullets splashing the water. The bundle sank, then exploded in a muffled blast that sent shockwaves through the timbers. The bridge held, but only barely. From that day on, the engineer admitted, he never looked at the river the same way again. Every floating shadow became a threat. Every cluster of debris was suspect. Not every attempt ended in success. There were countless failures, and the guerrillas knew it. Sometimes the balloons burst prematurely, their gas hissing away into the night. Sometimes the current betrayed them, sweeping their charges harmlessly into riverbanks or villages. Sometimes American patrols intercepted them, dragging the strange bundles ashore and laughing at their crude design before realizing they had come close to being killed by something that looked like children's toys. Yet the failures did not matter. Enough succeeded to make the tactic worth repeating. Enough explosions tore through pilings and beams to cripple convoys and slow the American advance. For the men who guarded the bridges, the psychological pressure was constant. American soldiers already faced ambushes, sniper fire, and mines on the roads. Now the rivers themselves seemed haunted. They fired at logs, at shadows, at clumps of vegetation. Ammunition was wasted on ghosts, but who could blame them? One night in the Mekong Delta, a convoy of trucks waited at dawn to cross a span. Sentries spotted what looked like balloons drifting near the pilings. Panic spread instantly. Soldiers opened fire, tracers ripping the water, while officers shouted for calm. The convoy was delayed for hours. Only later did they discover the balloons carried no explosives at all. They were decoys, released upstream by guerrillas who knew that fear was as powerful a weapon as fire. Meanwhile, the real charge had already struck another bridge miles away, collapsing it in flames. There were other nights when luck alone decided the outcome. In one case, American engineers fished a bundle of balloons from the river, dragging it onto the bank. They laughed at its crude knots and improvised jars. Only later did one of them notice a fuse inside, still smoldering weakly despite the water. By sheer fortune, dampness had extinguished it before it reached the charge. Had it burned a minute longer, the entire squad would have been torn apart. After that, there was no laughter. Even the crudest contraption could kill. Among the guerrillas, stories of success became legend. Fighters spoke of the night the Dong Nai River Bridge collapsed in a single thunderous blast, trucks tumbling into the current. Villagers whispered of the supply bridge near Can Tho that disappeared in fire without a shot being fired. Children carried rumors that the Americans feared balloons more than bullets. In a way, it was true. The absurdity of the weapon amplified its psychological power. Soldiers expected to die in battle with guns blazing, not to be blown apart by balloons floating in the dark. The preparation for each mission was itself a test of endurance and secrecy. Guerrillas moved only at night, carrying baskets of balloons disguised under food or supplies. Launch sites were chosen carefully, curves in the river where currents would naturally drift the bundles toward the target. Scouts studied the water for hours, memorizing the eddies and flows. Timing was everything. Too early, and the balloons might drift past before the charge ignited. Too late, and the fuse might sputter out before reaching the bridge. The men worked in silence, their ears tuned to every rustle of the jungle. A snapped twig could mean discovery, and discovery often meant death. Yet they persisted, night after night, because each successful blast meant American convoys stalled, operations delayed, and comrades elsewhere spared. For the Americans, the challenge was not only physical but emotional. They were trained to face enemy fire, but how do you fight balloons? One veteran recalled the humiliation of reporting to headquarters that his bridge had been crippled by rubber bags. "It sounded like a joke," he admitted, but there was nothing funny about watching steel sink into the river. Another remembered that after his first encounter, he could no longer sleep on guard duty. He stared at the water all night, heart pounding with every ripple, certain that death drifted toward him on the current. Commanders tried every measure they could imagine. Some ordered nets hung beneath bridges to catch the balloons. Others stretched barbed wire across channels. Patrol boats prowled miles upstream to intercept anything suspicious. Helicopters shone spotlights into the rivers at night. Yet the guerrillas adapted as fast as the Americans could respond. They launched further upstream, disguised their balloons in reeds, and timed their attacks with storms when no spotlight could see through the rain. For every defense, there was a counter. For every counter, another adaptation. The game never ended. One of the most dramatic balloon attacks came in 1967 along a key supply route in the Mekong Delta. The Americans had fortified the span with everything they could think of. Bunkers at both ends, floodlights sweeping the water, sentries armed with machine guns, even patrol boats circling upstream. It was a bridge considered invulnerable. Convoys rolled across it daily, carrying hundreds of tons of fuel and ammunition to forward bases. To lose it would mean paralysis in the entire sector. And yet, on a moonless night heavy with the weight of humidity, the bridge fell. The guerrillas had prepared for weeks. Scouts studied the current, timing how long it would take for debris to drift from the launch site to the pilings. Women melted wax into clay jars, sealing charges carefully. Men scavenged explosives from dud bombs and shells. Children collected discarded rubber from American trash heaps, carrying it back to the camp like treasure. By lantern light, they inflated the balloons, the hiss of gas mixing with the hum of insects. Baskets of them were carried to the river under the cover of darkness, hidden beneath mats and rice sacks. The fighters worked silently, knowing that one careless noise could summon death. They launched the bundles upstream, watching them vanish into the night. For a long while, there was nothing but the sound of water. On the bridge, American sentries smoked and shifted, their eyes straining. The river looked empty. Then came the blast. It was as if the river itself had erupted. Fire tore through the pilings, the night sky flared orange, and the thunder of collapsing steel rolled across the delta. Trucks waiting to cross sat stranded, their headlights glinting on the wreckage. The patrol boats searched desperately, sweeping spotlights across the water, but the saboteurs were gone, already melting into the jungle. The bridge that could not fall had been humbled by balloons drifting on the current. The attack stunned American command. Engineers rushed to rebuild, erecting a temporary pontoon span. Helicopters ferried supplies until convoys could move again. But the psychological blow lingered. If a fortified bridge could fall to balloons, what else was safe? Soldiers grew restless, scanning the rivers with haunted eyes. Officers filed reports they could barely believe themselves. And in Hanoi, the story spread like wildfire. The superpower had been crippled not by tanks or missiles, but by air trapped in scraps of rubber. After that night, balloon attacks became legend. They were never the dominant weapon of the war, but they did not need to be. Their power lay in their symbolism and the fear they inspired. Every soldier who guarded a bridge wondered if tonight would be the night when silence turned to thunder. Every convoy commander looked uneasily at the river as his trucks rolled across. Fear slowed as many operations as explosions did. And for the guerrillas, that was victory enough. When the war finally ended, the memory of the balloons lingered. Veterans told stories of nights on guard when the river seemed alive with menace, when every ripple looked like death. In the end, bridges did not fall only to bombs dropped from planes or artillery shells fired from afar. They also fell to balloons released by hands that had once planted rice or mended fishing nets. That is the story of asymmetrical war. The small finding ways to wound the mighty, the poor turning scraps into weapons, the weak proving that imagination can be deadlier than steel. The war in Vietnam showed that technology cannot conquer willpower, and that even the simplest of things, a cluster of rubber balloons filled with gas, could bring steel and stone crashing into the river.